This is part of our cholesterol lecture, and this video will be fun, full of facts, and tons of different cultures who have huge cholesterol levels, who eat saturated animal fat every day, who have no history of coronary artery disease. So just more bizarre facts, interesting facts, but it goes to the theorem of if you have high cholesterol and you have high saturated animal fat, shouldn't you have high heart disease? And why do all these cultures seem to miss that mark? And why are we applying that data to our culture? Half the people having heart attacks have low cholesterol. All the people with high homocysteine levels have heart attacks. So there's an interesting little tidbit I pulled out of the research. The first one I thought was interesting was human breast milk. 50% is cholesterol. Greatest nutritional demand as a little baby trying to grow. And you'd wonder, well, if you give your baby high cholesterol and high saturated animal fat for, 9 months on an average, how come babies don't have artery problems? So, that one kind of makes me scratch my head, but we'll just kind of move on. The Japanese in Okinawa, the people in Okinawa, an island south of Japan, are well known for the longevity and excellent health, to the extent that books have been written about the Okinawan diet. And we tried to mimic some of that in the United States diet, which is where we started to begin to get our inclinations for soy so many years ago. Although the Japanese eat very few dairy products, the notion is that their diet was low in fat is a myth. Rather, it contains moderate amounts of eggs, pork, chicken, fish, organ meat. There's something Americans don't like to eat. They eat tons of that. And fatty fish like tuna and salmon and seafood. And they're all relatively high in saturated animal fat and cholesterol. They call it the Japanese paradox if you want to Google it. Low fat with high carbs, people die a lot. When you decrease the carbs and you increase the fat, you'll watch the stroke level plummet. Kind of an interesting, different viewpoint. Moving on, the French. The French are well known for their love of good and rich food, even though they have relatively low heart disease and other degenerative diseases compared with, say, Americans. The French contain a diet high in butter, cheese, cream, eggs, meats, liver, and pâtés. And nationally, they have very little exercise. So that seems like a culture aimed at an abomination for heart disease. Oddly, they don't. In France, the rate of heart disease is 145 per 100,000, compared to, in the United States, 315 per 100,000 of middle-aged men. So, we're over double their number, even though they barely exercise and eat tons of fat, like, goose fat and pâtés and all the richness of that French cuisine. In Gascony, where goose and duck livers form a staple of the diet, the risk of heart disease is actually 80 per 100,000. I mean, that's kind of bizarre, interesting. Even though on a culture, when they're nationally polled, they have similar LDL and HDL levels compared to other EU countries, and similar blood pressures and percentages of obesities compared to other EU countries, but had lower rates of heart disease. So that was kind of interesting to me. Eskimos eat a diet high in saturated animal fat. They have very low risk of heart disease due to the high omega-3s in their diet. So we'll be talking about that later. Aborigine males have low cholesterol, low BMI, low blood pressure, low HDL, and their risk of heart disease really isn't that big of a deal. Mediterranean groups. We used to study the Mediterranean diet. Now we call it the classic Mediterranean diet, but they used to have cholesterol levels over 600 and have no heart disease, culturally, over generations. And it's called the Mediterranean paradox if you want to Google that, but it was a pretty interesting thing. On one Greek island of Crete, for example, fat made up 70% of the total diet. I just thought, wow, isn't that amazing? Typically, in the history, the Jews had, especially when they lived in Yemen, ate plenty of saturated animal fats from eggs and meats and butter, and they had very low levels of heart disease and diabetes. Versus if you look at modern Jews as a culture, they have a much higher rate of heart disease because they've incorporated margarine and vegetable oils and sugar, and the numbers just skyrocketed. Indians in North and South India, they used to consume plenty of meat, and they cooked with ghee or clarified butter, which was high in saturated animal fat. And the Indians in the South were more vegetarian and fish eaters, and they cooked with coconut oil, which is also high in saturated fat. And until recently, both groups had very low risk of heart disease. It was only when they got more modern that they developed higher risks of heart disease, because they got rid of some of those traditional things and they used more refined oils, and they used less fat, used more carbs, and now their heart disease is going up. Interesting PhD, Associate Professor of Biochemistry, of Biological and Molecular Science at Oxford, the chief editor in Nutritional Research Review, and well-known limbic chemist named Michael Gurr, PhD, said whatever causes coronary disease, it is not primarily a high intake of saturated animal fat. I just thought that quote was argumentative, interesting, and well worth looking into. He probably seems to know more about lipid chemistry than I ever will, and why would a man at that level of intelligence and research say a statement like that? So he's worth Googling. Perhaps the most compelling research was published in 2004 issue of American Journal of Clinical Nutrition by researchers from Harvard School of Public Health. So there's an interesting group to quote. Their study showed that in postmenopausal women with heart disease, a higher saturated animal fat intake was associated with less narrowing of the coronary arteries and reduced progression of the disease. Even with similar LDLs, women with lower saturated animal fat had much higher rates of heart disease. So you had higher saturated fat intake was associated with HDL, the good cholesterol, and lower triglyceride levels. So they have some controversial issues inside the Harvard School of Public Health. Rather, high levels of blood sugar and insulin-promoted fat storage increase blood triglyceride levels and inflammation within the arteries, which is what kicks off the whole problem of that clot. Is one of the things they pointed out and said, we want to look at these repair mechanisms and what's causing these injuries. In other words, high intake of carbs, and the higher the blood sugars and the higher the insulin, the more likely you are to develop heart disease, no matter what your fat intake is. Anyway, remember, it's easier to believe what you've been told than it is to research it for yourself, so go take a look. Google all you want, or use whatever search engine you like. If you got any questions, email office@nuka.info or set up a consultation with me and we'll talk about it. Make it a great day.